Okay, good. I guess you have seen this paper recently published in BBS talking about the possible bias, political bias in social psychology. I don't know, what are you
Yeah, well, I think the people, well, this is an issue which has plagued social science and social psychology for some time. The first major objection to it, this kind of bias, and I think the bias does exist, was pointed out by Phil Tetlock and company a decade or more ago. And the claim is that because of the imbalance, the ideological imbalance between the right and the left within social science in general, and social psychology perhaps, and political psychology in particular, the kinds of questions that are being asked are skewed, the kind of evidence being marshaled is skewed, and it's preventing people from looking at the same phenomena from different ideological perspectives. And that's not really good for the science of social psychology, of social sciences in general. And I think there's some truth to that, right? When something of the order of 85 or 90% of all social psychologists identify with the left or the liberal parties, or the Social Democratic Party in Europe, or the Democratic Party in the United States, it's a problem. And the question is what to do about it, I think. I mean, I think one of the major reasons for this ideological bias is that people on the ideological right often don't have the same interests in social issues that people on the left do. I mean, their interests primarily go towards economic development or financial issues or economics or those kinds of issues. And it's hard to get them, I think, to be comfortable in a class in sociology or political psychology. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm not sure if the self-selection is the main problem in this article. One of the reasons they give to produce this bias will be that right-wingers will find kind of a hostile environment within the social science or within social psychology, and that will stop them to join. Even those who might have an initial interest could stop themselves just because they could find this kind of hostile environment. And I think that might be linked to the idea that in the social science there is a hidden agenda, and sometimes not so hidden, of social change, certain kind of social change.
So what they call social progress.
Yeah, exactly, through social inequality. And we can see that in political psychology. For instance, the research on prejudice is very prominent, and that is obviously having a certain intention. I mean, researchers on prejudice are trying to solve the problems of discrimination or so, and that that has an ideological ground or an ethical ground, if you want, not a scientific ground. So my concern will be, is that political agenda kind of stopping us on addressing other issues that might be relevant for society, which are in the conservative agenda.
Well, I think that's completely correct. I mean, one of the things, I've been aware of this problem for some time, ever since the 1960s, when I became interested in social problems and problems of racism and war and sexism and classism and those kinds of issues. And as a way to try to deal with that, I have deliberately tried to separate my interest in social policy, or refrain from making policy recommendations, so that my desired end goal wouldn't interfere with my analysis of contemporary scientific data or restrict the kinds of questions I would ask. It's really impossible to separate those two completely, but you can be aware of that tension between policy advocacy, which I think is deadly for theoretical social psychologists or social scientists. They should really try as much as possible not to engage in political activism, because that commits you to a certain kind of analysis and certain kinds of answers. And to free yourself from that as much as possible, you should really try to separate those issues. But that's not going to get it completely. But
yeah, certainly. And probably the reactions that your work based on evolutionary theories is an example of that, because what I have perceived in the field is that your evolutionary arguments are very much resisted by traditional social theories. Let's say, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's true. I mean, had I been a sort of typical social psychologist, a political psychologist, and tried to unite my science for the purpose, or utilize it for the purpose of social change and social policy recommendations, I probably would not have come up with this theory to begin with, right? Which, on the surface, seems a little bleak and a little deterministic, which it isn't, I would argue, but it gives that impression. And in order to fit in certain social circles, I would have had to have restricted or tamped down those kinds of questions. I mean, I have lost friends for many years over this theory I've developed. Taking an evolutionary perspective is so unpopular on the left that, it does damage interpersonal relationships with people. And so, if you're interested in making real progress in the social sciences, it's really critically important that you try not to allow your own desires for social change or social equality or social justice to direct or steer the kinds of questions you ask.
Yeah, and I also have the impression that probably more relevant than increasing the numbers of left-leaning researchers will be to try to have assessments of the research that are less biased, because the final test of any theory will be the way it is tested, and that should be not biased. And I think that tools like the peer review process for grants or for publications allows for a lot of political bias in the because it's not a strict test of scientific rigor and so on. So somehow I have the impression that all these movements towards a more strict standards of scientificity of the research will even help to control this political bias. It's not just a matter of including people with a different view, but also putting higher standards to around
I think that'll help somewhat. And I think another technique that can be used to try to attenuate this bias, this tendency towards ideological twisting of evidence or questions, which is even more important than the answers you get, but the questions you pose to the data to begin with, is doing research jointly with people on the other side of the ideological continuum to yourself. That becomes an automatic sort of check on sort of hidden assumptions that are hard for you to observe directly, but a person with a very different ideological bent would pick up very quickly. And I've written a couple of papers like that early in my career when I was a PhD student in Stockholm, Sweden. I had a roommate who was slightly more right-wing than I was, and we would get into political arguments all the time. And the way we tried to settle the argument was often by doing research together, right? Posing the question to be answered together, looking at the operationalization of constructs and both approving them together. And I think that was really very helpful in terms of helping us to produce some, at least more ideologically neutral science.
And how helpful do you think it could be that researchers disclose their political ideologies beforehand?
That's tricky, I think. Ideally, scientific article should be written in such a way that it's impossible to tell the ideological orientation of the writer or the scientist. If you disclose ahead of time that I am say a social democrat, or make it widely known, then that runs the risk of having people automatically shut out or refuse to even read the work that you've written. Right? So that's a problem. I think the test should be the almost near impossibility of picking out through reading of the work the ideological orientation of the writer. And I think if you can do that, that's coming a long way towards producing a more balanced approach to these questions.